Agatha Raisin and James Lacey's final choice. Good evening and welcome, dear friends. A quiet evening in Carsley shatters when Agatha Raisin discovers a sealed envelope on her doorstep bearing James Lacey's handwriting and his final decision about their future. Before she can open it, a shadow moves across her garden path, leaving her wondering who else knows what James intends. Before Agatha steps into today's mystery, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments works as a fuel and motivate us to make more mystery every day. So do comment. And if these stories bring you comfort, do subscribe so you never miss a moment. So let's begin.
Chapter 1. The Letter That Shouldn't Wait. Agatha Raisin had expected the evening to unfold with its usual blend of comfort and faint annoyance. A warm fire, a mediocre frozen meal, and the steady hum of village quiet outside her cottage windows. Yet as twilight settled across Carsley, she found herself unable to relax. She drifted from room to room, touching objects without purpose, straightening cushions she had already straightened, and opening cabinets as though the simple act of looking inside them might distract her restless mind. Something felt out of place, though she couldn't yet say what. The fire crackled invitingly in the sitting room, but she didn't sit. Instead, she crossed to the kitchen and poked half-heartedly at the kettle before abandoning the idea of tea. Moments later, she lingered by her desk, scanning envelopes, bills, and a stack of catalogs she had been meaning to throw out. Nothing caught her attention until one envelope, slightly tucked beneath a gardening flyer, revealed the familiar slant of handwriting she knew better than she cared to admit. James Lacey. Her breath hitched. It wasn't dramatic, not a gasp or anything that would alarm a bystander, but just enough for her to feel her pulse trip over itself. She picked up the envelope slowly, almost cautiously, as if it might shift in her hand and reveal more than she was prepared for. His handwriting was unmistakable, steady, formal, precise, the same style he used for everything from simple notes to stern complaints. She hadn't been expecting anything from him, certainly not this. Agatha carried the envelope to the window where the last of the evening light lingered. She angled it gently, examining it as though it were evidence in one of her countless unofficial investigations. The paper wasn't new. There were faint creases along one side, and a small smudge near the flap, almost as if the seal had been pressed, released, and then pressed again. Even stranger were the faint marks along the edges, scuffs, as though the envelope had been handled more times than necessary. She traced a thumb along the seam. If James wanted to speak to her, he would normally come in person, appearing at her gate with that maddening expression halfway between politeness and emotional distance. Why a letter? And why one that looked as though it had gone on a small journey before reaching her? Agatha set the envelope on the desk, but didn't reach for the letter opener. She paced. She muttered under her breath. She glared at it. The longer she waited, the heavier the room seemed to grow, as if the envelope itself were absorbing the quiet. Outside, the garden stirred. A soft rustle swept along the hedge, the sound crisp enough to break her focus. Agatha froze. It wasn't a dramatic noise, but distinct, purposeful against the otherwise still air. Her eyes narrowed toward the window. The fading light made it hard to see, yet she had the sudden, unreasonable feeling that someone stood just beyond the gate, watching the cottage with patient interest. She moved closer, pressing her fingertips lightly against the glass. The garden looked ordinary enough, the stone path, the drooping roses she kept meaning to prune, the gate she never remembered oiling. But the rustling came again, softer this time, fading as quickly as it had arrived. Wind, she muttered, though she didn't fully believe it. Returning to the desk, she picked up the envelope once more. The tension in the cottage was subtle but unmistakable, like the air before a mild storm. She wasn't sure whether the heaviness came from the letter, the strange movement outside, or her own unruly feelings where James Lacey was concerned. Perhaps all three. She hovered over the envelope again, ready to break the seal, then lowered it slowly. Not yet. Once opened, whatever waited inside would change the shape of her evening. perhaps even more than that. For now, she simply stood in the quiet of her cottage, holding a message she wasn't quite prepared to read. Agatha hadn't anticipated visitors this evening, yet the knock at her door was a welcome interruption. She opened it to find Mrs. Bloxby standing on the doorstep, a basket of freshly baked scones and a small jar of her famous lemon curd in hand. The older woman's presence was immediately calming, a steady counterpoint to the storm of anxious thoughts whirling through Agatha's head. She stepped aside, gesturing for Mrs. Bloxby to enter, and closed the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to signal the beginning of a new, quieter kind of investigation. "Evening, dear," Mrs. Bloxby said, her eyes scanning Agatha's slightly disheveled appearance. "You look preoccupied." She carried herself with her usual composed grace, her observations gentle but unerring. Agatha hesitated, clutching the envelope she had discovered, debating whether to reveal it yet. She could feel Mrs. Bloxby's discerning gaze upon her, as though the older woman could sense the weight of every unsaid thought. Finally, Agatha sighed and placed the letter on the edge of the kitchen table, fidgeting with a loose strand of her hair. "Something's arrived," Agatha admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "From James." Mrs. Bloxby nodded knowingly, setting the basket down and smoothing her skirt. "Ah, that explains a great deal. May I?" She extended her hand toward the envelope, and Agatha reluctantly allowed it. She lifted it, turning it over in her hands with meticulous care. She murmured, and Agatha frowned. "What?" "Nothing alarming," Mrs. Bloxby said, softly. "But I notice a few things. The paper itself appears newer than the ink used for the address, and the seal," she tapped lightly on the faint smudge, "was pressed unevenly. Someone may have handled this before it reached you." Agatha stiffened, the letter suddenly heavier in her mind. "Handled by who?" she whispered. Mrs. Bloxby shrugged, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. "That, my dear, is the question. Perhaps no one. Perhaps someone who thought it prudent to ensure James' intentions were filtered. There are many hands in the world that find their way into letters." She smiled gently, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "You mustn't jump to worst-case scenarios, but neither should you ignore what seems unusual." Agatha chewed her lower lip, torn between impatience and cautious curiosity. "I suppose I'm afraid," Agatha admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "Not of the letter itself, but of what it might say, what it might change." Mrs. Bloxby placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "That's natural, but hiding from a truth, even a simple one like a letter, is rarely helpful. Sometimes facing it with company makes the difference." Her tone was warm, steady, yet carried the faintest hint of challenge. "Read it, yes, but read it with eyes open, aware." They moved to the sitting room together, settling by the fire with a comfortable sense of routine. Agatha poured tea while Mrs. Bloxby arranged the scones. Their conversation drifted naturally from village gossip to recollections of James, each anecdote softening the tension. Yet under the surface, both women were aware. This letter was not just a note from a man, it was a message weighted with history, emotion, and a subtle mystery waiting to unfold. Agatha picked up the envelope once more, turning it over in her hands. Mrs. Bloxby observed quietly, noting the faint scuffs along the edges and the way Agatha hesitated before touching the seal. She said, "You see, sometimes the smallest details tell the biggest stories. Perhaps you should consider what journey this envelope took before it arrived here, and who, if anyone, guided it along the way." Agatha nodded slowly, her curiosity and unease entwined. The warmth of the room, the gentle presence of her friend, and the quiet scrutiny of the envelope combined to create a moment of both comfort and tension. She realized, almost reluctantly, that this evening would not be ordinary after all. And so, with tea in hand and a friend by her side, Agatha prepared to confront the letter's mysteries, beginning a careful, deliberate dance between anticipation, trust, and the first seeds of doubt about the letter's journey. Chapter 2. The Envelope Opens. Agatha sat at her desk, the envelope finally resting in her lap, as if it had been waiting for the precise moment she had gathered enough courage to face it. She took a deep breath, letting her fingers linger on the paper for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The anticipation buzzed quietly in the room, mingling with the fading warmth of the fire and the subtle aroma of Mrs. Bloxby's scones from the evening before. This was not a letter she could skim. Every line, every curve of the handwriting promised significance. With deliberate care, she broke the seal, noting again the smudge that Mrs. Bloxby had pointed out earlier. The paper inside was faintly textured, cool to the touch, and bore James's familiar, precise script. Agatha's heart thumped audibly in her chest as she unfolded it, careful not to crease what she imagined might be words of great consequence. She read the first few lines aloud softly, almost involuntarily, as if hearing the words would give them more weight. "My dearest Agatha," the letter began, and already the tone struck her, formal, considered, yet threaded with intimacy. "I write with urgency and reflection, having reached a conclusion I did not anticipate, and yet one that has become unavoidable. There are matters I must settle, matters long buried, and their resurfacing has compelled me to reconsider many things, most importantly, my own choices and ours." Agatha paused, letting the words sink in. She could hear the careful pauses, the thoughtfulness in the phrasing, yet there was also a certain distance. James was near in expression, but far in clarity. She read on, her pulse quickening as the sentences folded layers of meaning she could not yet discern. "I ask only that you meet me tomorrow morning in the quiet of Carsley, so we might speak without distraction. There are matters from the past that must be acknowledged, truths that affect what I intend, and how I hope our future might unfold. I cannot convey them adequately in writing, and it is not right that you should wait any longer in uncertainty." Agatha's lips parted slightly, a whisper escaping. "Truths from the past?" she asked. She looked down at the page, scanning for any hint, any elaboration that would guide her mind, but the lines ended abruptly. There was no closing paragraph, no final signature beyond his name. She glanced around the room, as if the walls themselves might offer context, but the quiet remained unyielding. Something felt off. The ending was sudden, almost careless, but not carelessness, more like intentional omission. Her curiosity, mingled with concern, flared sharply. Had pages gone missing, or had James chosen to leave parts unsaid, deliberately? The possibilities spiraled in her mind, each one twisting with potential meaning. Agatha set the letter down gently and called softly, "Mrs. Bloxby, could you come here a moment?" The older woman appeared almost immediately, drawn by the urgency in Agatha's tone. She perched on the arm of the chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes curious. Agatha read the lines aloud, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of tension. Mrs. Bloxby listened intently, nodding slowly. "He writes with care," she said quietly, "but there is much unsaid. You can sense it, can't you? That there are pieces hidden behind the words, as if he fears what might be revealed if he wrote everything down. Tomorrow, that's no accident. He wants to speak to you directly. Whatever this is, it carries weight." Agatha rubbed her temples lightly, the puzzle pressing on her mind. Her chest tightened with anticipation, and yet there was a peculiar thrill in the uncertainty. She knew the letter would mark the beginning of a day unlike any other, a day where questions would demand answers, and answers might bring clarity or further complication. For now she could only hold it, sensing both the intimacy and the distance threaded through each careful word. The sound of Mrs. Bloxby's retreating footsteps faded into the night, leaving Agatha alone with the letter and the uneasy quiet of her cottage. She set the kettle aside, its faint warmth no longer comforting, and sank into a chair by the window. The letter lay in her lap, its abrupt ending pressing at the edges of her thoughts. She unfolded it again, scrutinizing each curve of James' handwriting, noting the subtle variations in pressure and spacing that suggested his mind had been both determined and distracted while writing. It was hurried, yet precise, a tension that left her uneasy and curious in equal measure. She read the first lines aloud once more, her voice quieter this time, almost a whisper to herself. Each word seemed to carry weight she had not fully registered before. The phrases about the past, about choices made and consequences looming, lingered in her mind like shadows stretching across the walls. Agatha's fingers traced the margins of the page, as though touching the words might bring clarity. But clarity remained elusive, replaced instead by a swirl of questions, assumptions, and imagined scenarios. A sudden noise outside made her start. Footsteps, slow, deliberate enough to be intentional rather than the ordinary creak of the wind through hedges. Her heart tripped, then steadied, trained as it was for small mysteries. She rose and moved to the window, pressing her palms lightly against the glass. A figure moved near the garden gate, shadowed and indistinct, disappearing almost immediately behind the thick hedge lining her property. "Who's there?" she called softly, the words more a test than an accusation. The footsteps halted, then receded into silence, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the cool night air. Agatha's pulse quickened. Not panic exactly, but alert curiosity. She watched the space between the hedges, straining her eyes for any sign of movement, any clue as to the visitor's identity or intent. The figure had vanished, yet the sense of being observed lingered like a delicate perfume, subtle but unmistakable. For a long moment she debated calling Bill Wong, the ever-patient detective and occasional source of reassurance in her life. Yet the thought of dragging him into a mystery that might be personal, a letter intended only for her, gave her pause. This, she decided, was hers alone to consider. For now, she returned to the desk and pulled out her notebook, its pages waiting for precise notes, small observations, and minute details she would otherwise forget. Agatha began writing, the envelope's scuffed edges, the hurried yet careful handwriting, the abrupt ending, the sudden footsteps outside. Each detail was a clue, each hesitation a lead. She treated the letter like a case, analyzing the evidence and noting inconsistencies that might point to hidden intentions. Her mind, restless at first with anxiety, gradually settled into its familiar investigative rhythm. The puzzle became a companion, framing her thoughts and offering a temporary solace in focus and logic. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that contrasted with the gentle warmth of the fire. The shadows along the garden path shifted slightly, teasing her imagination, suggesting possibilities both mundane and extraordinary. Agatha didn't flinch. She made observations, catalogued the unknown, and allowed herself a small private thrill at the notion of discovery. The night had transformed into a canvas for her attention, each sound and movement a potential clue. Finally, she closed the notebook, resting a hand on the fire's warmth and letting her gaze drift once more to the gate. The figure was gone for now. The letter still held its secrets, and Agatha's mind turned steadily, parsing words, gestures, and shadows. The mystery had begun, small and subtle, but it had begun.
Chapter 3. The Meeting That Never Happens. Agatha arrived at the village green well before the hour she and James had agreed upon. The early morning mist curling softly around the hedges and lampposts, giving the familiar square an ethereal, almost secretive quality. She clutched the letter in one hand, her fingers pressing into the folded paper as though she could extract the meaning from touch alone. The damp grass beneath her shoes left tiny, cooling impressions, but she barely noticed. Her attention was entirely on the lane, straining for the first glimpse of James. She chose a bench near the fountain, settling herself with a small sigh. The cool mist mingled with the faint aroma of dew-soaked grass, and the distant crowing of a rooster provided an oddly comforting soundtrack. She unfolded the letter once more, skimming the lines she already knew by heart, hoping that staring at James' words might provide clarity, or, at the very least, a clue about why he had not yet arrived. Minutes stretched. Agatha's restlessness grew, her eyes flicking to the far end of the lane again and again. A jogger passed, nodding politely but oblivious to her concern. A delivery van rattled along the cobblestones, and a dog barked at a cat perched on a low wall. The village stirred in small, familiar ways, but none of it alleviated the knot forming in her stomach. "Morning, Miss Raisin," called Mrs. Pritchard, appearing from the mist with a basket of vegetables. She gave Agatha a curious look. "You're early." "I'm waiting for someone." She offered no further explanation, only a polite smile. Mrs. Pritchard raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, moving along with a soft chuckle. Agatha returned to scanning the lane. She wasn't prepared for the wave of irritation that rose when the minutes became half an hour, nor for the creeping worry that followed immediately after. Something was off. James never ran late without reason, and yet here she was, clutching a letter that promised answers while receiving none. From somewhere down the lane, a villager approached, hands in pockets. "Did you hear? Someone saw a man hurrying toward the woods at dawn. Looked like he had a purpose. Strange, isn't it?" He shrugged and moved on, leaving Agatha to turn the thought over. The woods, so close to the village green, yet secluded enough for secrets to be hidden. Another passerby added, as if sensing her attention, "And a car speeding away late last night. Might be nothing, of course, but people do talk." Agatha frowned, the threads of concern intertwining with her irritation. Her mind ran through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The man in the woods, the car, the sudden absence of James, all of it suggested a narrative far more complicated than a simple morning meeting. She crossed her arms, shifting on the bench, scanning the fog-draped horizon repeatedly, longing for a sign of him. The minutes dragged on. The mist thickened slightly, turning the green into a landscape of soft silhouettes and obscured edges. Agatha's frustration began to mix with dread. Had he never intended to come? Had the letter been a ploy, a message designed to stir her into worry? She tucked the envelope closer to her chest, as if shielding it from some unseen interference, and allowed herself a moment to consider that possibility. The fountain gurgled quietly, birds called from the trees, and villagers went about their small routines. All of it seemed mundane, yet somehow significant, each ordinary sound magnified by the expectation that James would appear at any moment. She waited, scanning, wondering, and, above all, trying to quiet the storm of suspicion and anticipation that had settled around her like the morning mist.
Agatha was halfway through pacing the green for what felt like the 100th time when she spotted Bill Wong striding along the misted lane. His dark coat was buttoned high against the chill, and his expression was unusually grave, drawing her attention immediately. Even from a distance, she could sense the weight he carried. He never wore worry lightly. "Agatha," he called, his voice firm but carrying an undertone of unease. She waved, her heart skipping in an odd mix of relief and tension. "Bill," she replied, hurrying toward him, the letter now carefully folded in her hand. "You've come early, I suppose?" He shook his head, stopping just short of the fountain. "I didn't come for pleasantries, I'm afraid. We need to talk." His gaze swept briefly over the green, as though measuring how much the mist might conceal. Agatha's stomach tightened. She had felt something wrong since dawn, but hearing it confirmed in his tone made it real. "Talk? About James?" Her voice wavered slightly. Bill nodded. "Yes. He contacted the police early this morning before he was supposed to meet you here, but then he never showed up. No one knows where he is, and so for now, a missing person file has been tentatively opened." Agatha's eyes widened. Her pulse raced and her hands tightened around the letter. Panic surged first, an instinctive icy wave, and then anger followed, sharper and hotter. A missing person file? He was supposed to be here. I had the letter. Why would he contact the police but not come to me? It makes no sense." Her voice carried a blend of exasperation and fear, classic Agatha at her most combustible. Bill held up a hand, calm but insistent. "I understand, but listen, from what I've gathered, James has been investigating something privately, something he did not, or perhaps could not, bring to official attention." Agatha's brow furrowed, a mix of determination and disbelief forming. "Something he didn't tell anyone? Then I have to be involved. I have to know." Bill sighed, the corner of his mouth twitching in a brief, almost apologetic smile. "Agatha, I can share only fragments. This involves someone connected to his military past. That's all I can confirm. Details beyond that are sensitive, confidential. I wasn't privy to the full scope either." Agatha's mind immediately whirred, connecting dots, imagining scenarios, and envisioning James acting alone in ways both brave and reckless. She clutched the letter tighter, feeling the juxtaposition of intimacy and distance in his words, now weighted with real danger. "Confidential or not, Bill, I know James. I can help. I have to help." Bill regarded her with a mix of exasperation and reluctant respect. "You do realize this isn't just a missing letter or a simple misunderstanding. Whatever he's involved with could be dangerous. That said," he paused, weighing the decision, "if you insist on being part of this, I'll provide guidance. But you must follow instructions exactly. No improvisation, and no distractions." Agatha blinked, a spark of defiance lighting her eyes, despite the underlying tension. "Instructions, yes, but distractions? That's practically impossible for me, Bill Wong." He shook his head, but allowed a small chuckle to escape, the first softness in his expression all morning. "All right, but understand this. What James left behind and the letter you received are threads leading to something far larger than a casual morning meeting. You must be careful. And Agatha," his tone sharpened slightly, "this concerns a part of his life that very few people knew. Military connections, sensitive matters. Curiosity can be dangerous." Agatha nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. Her mind raced with questions, worries, and the irresistible urge to start piecing together the puzzle immediately. Whatever James had stumbled upon, the stakes had just risen, and she felt both fear and exhilaration in equal measure. She clutched the letter once more, determined to uncover every hidden meaning.
Chapter 4. Shadows from James's Past. Bill led Agatha through the quiet corridors of the Carsley police station, the muted hum of fluorescent mites above, and the faint clatter of filing drawers echoing around them. They paused outside a door marked Archives, and Bill pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, a comforting musty scent that reminded Agatha of old libraries and hidden secrets waiting to be uncovered. She followed him inside, her eyes scanning the rows of cabinets and shelves stacked with folders of cases both mundane and perplexing. He gestured toward a table near the center. "This is what James requested access to," Bill said, setting down a thick manila folder with careful reverence. "I can't share everything. Much of this is sensitive, but I can allow you to observe. Read between the lines if you can." Agatha picked up the file, her fingers brushing against the crisp, slightly brittle edges of the papers within. The top sheet was heavily redacted, blocks of black ink obscuring names, dates, and locations. Even so, enough remained to hint at the story beneath: a tense incident involving a former comrade, a dispute that had been quietly buried, and references to obligations James felt compelled to honor. All of it seemed faintly familiar in phrasing, tone, and implication. Her eyes scanned a partially visible line: "Acknowledged promise to redacted regarding unresolved matter." Agatha frowned. Something about that phrasing resonated with her. She imagined James, disciplined and steadfast, taking it upon himself to ensure that old debts were paid even decades after they had first arisen. The weight of responsibility seemed to seep from the words, forming a bridge between the past and the urgency hinted at in the letter. Bill watched her closely, allowing silence to fill the space as she pieced the fragments together. Agatha made notes in her mind, the names erased, the dates partially visible, the careful avoidance of direct language. Each omission was itself a clue, deliberately leaving breadcrumbs for anyone attentive enough to notice. She leaned closer to the folder, tracing the remaining words with a fingertip as though she could read between the blacked-out sections. A detail caught her eye, a location partially visible beneath one of the redactions, the name of a village not far from Carsley, one that had been mentioned recently in local chatter. Villagers' observations, the fleeting presence of unknown visitors, and James's sudden disappearance now aligned in her mind with this location. Something was stirring there, something that perhaps required James's intervention and now, indirectly, her own. "Bill," she said softly, eyes still scanning the pages, "I think I see a connection. Look at this location. Doesn't it match some of the things happening near the edge of Carsley recently?" He leaned over slightly, not removing his professional restraint, but acknowledging her observation. "You may be right. I can't confirm the full extent, but the pattern is suggestive. James didn't involve anyone lightly, and he certainly wouldn't leave a loose end. Whatever he's acting on, it has roots in that old matter." Agatha's pulse quickened. The redactions, the vague mentions, the partial lines, they were all puzzles, inviting speculation, yet each hinted at deeper truths. The promise James felt compelled to honor, the comrade whose name remained hidden, and the incident carefully kept off record, all of it suggested a burden that weighed heavily on him. Now the notion of the final choice, referenced in the letter, began to coalesce in her mind. A decision not merely about feelings, but about duty, legacy, and responsibility. She closed the folder carefully, taking a measured breath. The quiet of the archive room seemed to press around her, holding her attention like a secret waiting to be revealed. Every redacted line, every hint, every shadowed reference drew her deeper into the web James had been navigating alone, and now into a mystery she was determined to follow with eyes wide open. Agatha looked up at Bill, her expression a mixture of determination and thoughtfulness. "I understand now," she said quietly. "It's more than just a letter. It's about him settling something serious." Bill nodded, allowing a small sigh to escape. "Exactly. And that's why time is crucial. You're starting to see the contours of it, but the full picture remains hidden."
Agatha returned to her cottage under a sky painted in soft grays, the early afternoon mist still lingering and curling along the hedges like whispered secrets. Her mind was preoccupied with the archive file and James' letter, every thought revolving around the weight of decisions and the shadows of the past. She had almost reached the gate when she noticed a figure standing there, partially obscured by the morning fog that had yet to dissipate. The woman was slender, her posture tense, and her coat tightly buttoned against the chill. She held a small bag close, as if it contained something precious, and her eyes darted nervously toward the road and hedgerows. Agatha slowed, instinctively aware that this visitor carried a sense of urgency and perhaps even fear. "Good afternoon," Agatha called, keeping her voice calm but curious. "Can I help you?" The woman stepped forward, her gaze flitting briefly to the cottage, then back to Agatha. I hope I'm not intruding," she said, voice low, hurried, and slightly unsteady. "My name is Eleanor March. James, he helped me a long time ago. Recently he reached out again, and now—" She hesitated, swallowing hard, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Agatha's eyebrows lifted in both surprise and intrigue. "Helped you?" she echoed. "I don't believe we've met before." "No," Eleanor admitted quickly. "You haven't. But James, he intervened in something that could have ruined me years ago. I don't like to involve others, but you must understand he's in danger. Someone he exposed long ago has resurfaced. I saw the signs. He didn't come to you by chance, and now I fear what might happen if he remains alone." Agatha felt her chest tighten, the familiar coil of worry and protective instinct constricting around her ribs. "Danger? "What kind of danger?" she pressed, stepping closer, her voice edged with both concern and frustration. Eleanor shook her head, her expression fearful. I shouldn't say more. It's safer if you know just this. He is not safe, and someone is waiting, watching, someone who has long memories and little mercy." Her glance flicked toward the road, where the vague outline of a car could just be made out through the mist, engine idling, shadowed in grey. Before Agatha could ask another question, Eleanor's shoulders stiffened and she turned abruptly toward the waiting vehicle. I must go," she said hurriedly. "Please, believe me. Be careful." With a fluid motion, she climbed into the back seat, the engine growling softly as it pulled away. The mist swallowed it almost immediately, leaving Agatha blinking at the empty space where the woman had stood moments before. Agatha's irritation flared first, sharp and sudden. People never gave her time to ask questions, always arriving with half-truths and vanishing before she could gather the full picture. Yet beneath that irritation was a deeper, more insistent anxiety. Eleanor's warning confirmed what she had feared. James's disappearance was not simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. She stood for a long moment, leaning against the gate, clutching the letter tightly, trying to make sense of the encounter. Who was Eleanor truly? How well had James known her, and what had he uncovered that now threatened him? The sight of the waiting car, empty and ghost-like in the fog, pressed on her imagination, adding layers of urgency and uncertainty. Finally, Agatha exhaled slowly, shaking her head with a mixture of frustration and determination. People vanished, dangers loomed, and mysteries multiplied, but she refused to stand idly by. The warmth of her cottage behind her felt suddenly inadequate, a fragile comfort against the unknown that Eleanor had revealed. She tucked the letter and her notebook under her arm, resolved to piece together whatever clues she could, and to find James before the shadows from his past caught up with him.
Chapter 5. Into the Woods. Agatha approached Horseshoe Wood under the soft glow of late morning, the mist still clinging low to the hedgerows and tree trunks. She had followed the fragment of information offered by a villager earlier. A man, moving quickly, had been seen heading into the woods at dawn. The path was damp, the soil dark and malleable from recent rain, and as she stepped carefully, the subtle impressions of hurried footsteps immediately caught her attention. Each print told a story. Differences in shoe size, stride, and speed, evidence of someone moving with purpose rather than leisure. Her eyes flicked along the trail, scanning for further clues. There were smaller footprints alongside the larger ones, almost indistinct but present, an irregular rhythm that suggested someone had followed the first figure, or perhaps had been caught unprepared by a sudden dash. The thought prickled at her mind, sharpening her senses. Agatha crouched briefly, brushing a damp leaf aside, noting how the soil had been disturbed in small telling ways. A slight drag mark here, a splatter of mud there. Someone had run, but not recklessly. There was precision in the haste. The soft chirping of birds overhead contrasted sharply with the tension in her chest, a gentle reminder of the woodland's quiet normalcy, even as she tracked signs of an unusual disturbance. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and scattered beams, illuminating the path with shifting patches of gold. Agatha moved carefully, notebook in hand, jotting quick mental notes, direction, spacing of steps, and odd deviations in the trail. Every detail might matter later. She had learned that small observations often carried weight far beyond their appearance. A glint of paper caught her eye, half buried in mud near a shallow root. Kneeling, she retrieved it, brushing away the soil. The texture was familiar, slightly coarse like the stationery James had used for his letter. She held it up, inspecting the torn edge. Someone had removed pages from the letter, leaving this fragment behind. Her heart quickened. This was not a random scrap. It was a clue deliberately or carelessly discarded. She scanned it carefully, noting partial words, ink smudges, and the faint impression of handwriting. Every curve and stroke was familiar, yet frustratingly incomplete. Agatha straightened and continued along the path, more alert than before.
The impressions of multiple individuals were increasingly evident. Two sets of footprints occasionally converged, then diverged, suggesting a meeting or confrontation somewhere along the trail. The soil showed signs of sudden stops and quick turns, subtle indications of hesitation or surprise. Each step she took seemed to echo in the quiet woodland, yet the signs on the path whispered their own narrative, invisible to the casual observer, but unmistakable to her trained eye. She paused at a fork in the trail, crouching to examine the disturbance in the mud. One path was more heavily marked, churned by hurried passage, the other lighter, as though someone had carefully skirted the main route. Agatha made mental notes, tracing potential routes and imagining the sequence of movements. Somewhere along this woodland maze, a secret had been carried or abandoned, and she was following the traces with the patience and focus of a detective both persistent and intuitive. The torn scrap remained tucked carefully in her pocket, a tangible piece of James's communication, now bound up in her investigation. Agatha's thoughts shifted between the physical evidence and the emotional stakes. Someone had taken pages from the letter, leaving it incomplete for her, or for James's own protection. Yet the presence of multiple footprints suggested this was not a solitary act. The woods held more than shadows. They held questions, paths of intent, and the faint, elusive echoes of the morning's movements. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed deeper into Horseshoe Wood, alert to every sound, shadow, and impression. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches whispering above, and Agatha felt the familiar thrill of discovery mingle with her worry for James. Each step drew her closer to understanding, each clue a fragment of the truth waiting to be revealed.
Agatha pushed through a thicker section of undergrowth, her boots squelching softly in the damp soil. The path widened unexpectedly, revealing a small clearing bathed in a muted light that filtered through the canopy above. The serenity of the space struck her first, the sunlight pooling on fallen leaves, birds flitting among low branches, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Yet the tranquility was deceptive. Signs of recent disturbance immediately caught her eye. The earth was scuffed in irregular patterns, mud pressed into uneven ridges, suggesting a struggle or sudden movement. A low branch lay snapped near the center of the clearing, its jagged edges still raw and damp, as though pressure had been applied only moments ago, or at least that was the impression the evidence conveyed. Agatha's heart gave a sudden leap, the pulse in her temples quickening, yet she forced herself to remain composed. She had learned that panic rarely clarified anything. Observation did. Her gaze swept the clearing, landing on a small object partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. Kneeling, she picked it up carefully. It was a pen, familiar in its weight and design, the kind James favored when writing letters or making notes. The realization was immediate and electric. James had been here very recently, and perhaps not entirely of his own volition. The pen might have been dropped during a rush, or a scuffle, or a moment of distraction. Either way, it confirmed what her instincts had already suggested. The scene was no accident. Agatha stood, scanning the periphery of the clearing. Shadows pooled beneath trees, creating the illusion of movement where there was none, and the wind rustled through the branches in a soft, whispering hiss. For a fleeting instant, she imagined hearing a faint voice, perhaps a warning, perhaps no more than the wind twisting through the leaves. Her pulse accelerated, the line between natural sound and threat blurred. Still, she remained grounded, breathing deeply, letting the tension sharpen rather than overwhelm her. She marked the location carefully in her notebook, sketching rough lines and noting details. Scuffed earth, broken branch, the pen's position, and any deviations from the path leading back to the main trail. This was a place that needed to be revisited by someone official, someone who could catalog it properly. But for now, Agatha's careful observations were the closest thing to truth she could record. Her mind raced with possibilities. The scuffed patterns suggested more than one individual might have been present. Could James have been accompanied or pursued by someone else? The evidence was fragmentary, the story incomplete, but the threads were tangible. A sudden disturbance in a quiet clearing,
a personal belonging left behind, and the faint suggestion of movement in the surrounding trees. Each detail built tension, even amid the wood's calming beauty. For a moment, Agatha allowed herself to take in the serenity of the clearing, the soft hum of distant birds, the dappled sunlight, and the gentle sway of branches. It was a scene of calm, yet undercut with the unmistakable imprint of something urgent and troubling, cozy and dangerous, familiar and threatening. It perfectly mirrored the situation she faced, close to understanding, yet still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Finally, she exhaled and turned back toward the main path, her notebook securely tucked under her arm. The pen remained in her pocket, a tangible link to James and the moment he had passed through this space. Agatha felt the mix of anticipation and dread settle into a quiet determination. She was close, perhaps closer than ever, to unraveling the mystery, but the forest had kept its vital secret just out of reach. With careful, deliberate steps, she moved forward, leaving the clearing behind while carrying its clues in mind, ready to report them to Bill Wong and piece together the next chapter of James's disappearance.
Chapter 6. A Past Unfolding. Agatha entered James's study with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone entering sacred territory. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a comforting yet poignant mixture that carried echoes of evenings spent in thought, planning, and quiet companionship. Her eyes immediately scanned the shelves, searching for anything that might illuminate his recent actions, anything that could explain the urgency behind his letter. Drawers and folders yielded little at first, an assortment of documents, mundane household bills, and neatly stacked papers that suggested a methodical mind at work. Then, tucked behind a row of books on local history, Agatha spotted a worn envelope, yellowed at the edges but carefully preserved. Inside was a photograph, slightly curled from age. She held it gingerly, noting James with 3 fellow servicemen, all in uniform, standing at attention in front of what appeared to be a barracks building. One of the men had a faint pencil circle around his face. The subtle marking suggested intention without calling attention overtly. On the back, James had written a single phrase in his precise hand: "The debt remains." Agatha's mind leapt. This was not merely a nostalgic keepsake, it was a clue, a message frozen in time. The circled man might hold the key to whatever decision James had referenced in his letter. Agatha traced the penciled circle with a fingertip, imagining the countless hours James must have spent considering obligations, loyalty, and the consequences of past actions. Who was this man, and why did James feel bound to a debt he had carried for years? The phrase implied a promise unfulfilled, a responsibility lingering like a shadow. She carefully placed the photograph on the desk and reached for her notebook, jotting observations, expressions, posture, and the faint background details that might hint at location or timing. The next logical step, Agatha reasoned, was historical context. She dialed Charles Fraith, knowing that, despite his occasional charm and questionable discretion, his knowledge of military history and personnel could prove invaluable. The line clicked, and then, as expected, Charles answered with that casual, teasing warmth. "Agatha, always a pleasure, though I suspect it's not just to chat over tea this time." She explained the photograph and the phrase, careful to emphasize her need for insight rather than gossip. Charles paused, clearing his throat, before providing carefully framed details about postings, conflicts, and disputes among the men during their service. He mentioned names, bases, and incidents that had never reached public record, painting a picture of bonds formed under intense pressure and of disagreements carried quietly but stubbornly among those involved. Agatha listened intently, connecting the historical dots to the present. One particular name, offered casually by Charles, struck her as familiar. It matched, in part, the subtle hints provided by the woman who had visited her at the gate, Eleanor March.
Could this be the same person James had once helped? The one tied to his obligations and the debt now resurfacing? The photograph, the penciled circle, and Charles's reluctant revelations aligned in Agatha's mind like pieces of a puzzle. Emotions surged. Nostalgia for James's past, admiration for his steadfast sense of duty, and the growing tension of the unknown danger still looming. Agatha felt herself both a witness and participant, pulled deeper into a story that spanned decades, blending personal loyalty with the shadows of long-buried disputes. Agatha carefully returned the photograph to its envelope, her hands steady despite the thrum of anticipation in her chest. The pieces were slowly coming together: the circled man, the debt James had carried, the woman's sudden warning, all threads wove into a tapestry of intrigue, and Agatha felt the familiar thrill of uncovering connections while knowing the stakes were higher than ever. Determined, she scribbled a final note: track the circled man, cross-reference with Eleanor March, and anticipate James's next move. The past had opened a door, and now she was ready to step through it.
Agatha was reviewing her notes in the quiet of her study when a soft knock sounded at the door. She looked up to see Bill Wong standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and urgency. In his hand he held a small envelope, its edges slightly damp and smudged from handling. "Agatha," he began, stepping inside and placing the envelope carefully on her desk, "we found something that belongs to James." He opened it with deliberate care, revealing 2 loose pages. Agatha's pulse quickened immediately. She recognized the familiar stationery at once. The edges were torn raggedly, as if hastily removed from the rest of the letter. "These were recovered near the village boundary," Bill explained, his voice low. "Someone spotted them in the undergrowth during a routine patrol. They match the letter you received, though they contain new information." Agatha leaned in, fingertips brushing the papers, her heart hammering in anticipation. The first page revealed James's handwriting, precise yet hurried. It spoke of someone from his past who had returned to England with the intent to set things right. The language was careful, almost coded, but unmistakably urgent. Agatha felt the weight of his fear pressing in. He had worried not just for himself, but for her, aware that anyone targeting him could see her as a collateral risk. She read the second page slowly, aloud to Bill, noting the subtle tremor in her voice. James described the measures he had considered to protect her, his own conflict evident in the phrasing. He was torn between fulfilling obligations from long ago and shielding the person he cared for most. The words carried a quiet desperation that tugged at Agatha's heart, revealing a vulnerability she rarely saw in James, the protective instinct tempered by the knowledge that some dangers could not be entirely controlled. Bill watched her closely, offering a steady presence without interrupting. "He seems he didn't want anyone else caught in this mess," he said quietly. "That includes you. He's always been meticulous about anticipating risk." Agatha absorbed the weight of the pages, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Who had returned? What did they intend to set right? And why had the pages been discarded in the first place? The act of leaving them behind suggested urgency or perhaps a warning, yet it also implied that someone had handled the letter before her, someone aware of its significance. Each question spiraled into the next, deepening both her curiosity and her concern. She took a steadying breath, folding the pages carefully and placing them beside James's original letter. Emotions surged: fear, frustration, and a fierce determination. This was no longer just a puzzle or a missing person scenario. James's letter, the redacted file, the woman at the gate, and now these resurfaced pages all pointed to a network of hidden threats, obligations, and secrets. Agatha's resolve hardened. She would not allow James to face this danger alone, nor would she ignore the clues laid deliberately or accidentally before her. The protective instinct that had driven her to investigate before now intensified, intertwined with the thrill of uncovering long-buried truths. "Agatha,"
she said, finally looking up, her voice firm yet calm. "We need to track this. Every detail, every connection. I'm not stepping back this time." He nodded, understanding her resolve and the emotional weight behind it. Together, they began to map the pieces: the photograph, the letter fragments, the warnings, and the loose pages. Each clue, each insight brought them closer to the heart of the mystery. Agatha felt a surge of clarity and determination. The puzzle was far from complete, but the stakes had sharpened, and she was ready to follow the trail wherever it led. Even as the evening light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the desk, Agatha felt a steady sense of purpose. James's protective instincts, once hidden behind his carefully composed exterior, were now vividly apparent, and she was determined to meet his courage with her own.
Chapter 7. Convergence. The sky over Carsley was painted in shades of amber and soft violet as dusk settled, a quiet hush wrapping the village in its familiar, comforting rhythm. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, the scent of baking bread and peat mingling with the earthy aroma of damp cobbles. Yet beneath the surface calm, a subtle tension threaded the streets. Whispers flitted between neighbors, hushed comments about visitors who had been seen near the church, eyes cast toward the windows, cars parked in unusual spots, and the faint impression that someone had been asking questions about more than the weather. Agatha moved purposefully along the lane beside Charles Fraith, her notebook tucked under one arm. Charles, ever attentive and charming in his understated way, glanced around with a practiced air, nodding politely to a few villagers, but otherwise letting Agatha lead. She had a growing sense that the village itself was speaking in fragments, pieces of information scattered like breadcrumbs for anyone willing to notice. Each snippet mattered, and she had learned long ago that timing, subtlety, and patient observation could reveal more than confrontation. Near the vicarage, a small group of locals lingered, their chatter subdued but carrying hints of curiosity and unease. One elderly gentleman, leaning on a cane, murmured about a car that had been parked near the vicarage for longer than seemed reasonable, its presence unusual enough to provoke speculation. Agatha jotted it down, noting the time and direction he had seen it depart. Charles leaned in with a quiet aside, offering the kind of historical context that only someone with his social knowledge could provide. Patterns of village visitors, the ebb and flow of unexpected arrivals, and the types of inquiries that usually preceded more serious events. Further along, a shopkeeper mentioned an unfamiliar woman asking gentle but pointed questions about Agatha's routine. She had smiled politely, bought a few items, and left without revealing her purpose, yet something about the inquiries had unsettled the shopkeeper. Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. The convergence of details, the car, the mysterious woman, the whispers near the church, suggested that the threads she had been following were drawing closer together. They paused at the church gate, where twilight cast long, soft shadows across the stone steps. Agatha surveyed the area, noting subtle signs of movement, footprints in the soft soil near the hedge, a discarded wrapper that suggested a hurried snack, and the faint impression of a lingering presence. Each detail, seemingly insignificant alone, began to coalesce into a broader pattern. Someone had been searching for James, or perhaps for her, and the village, so familiar and comfortable, had transformed into a quiet stage for intrigue. Charles, sensing her train of thought, offered a light comment about the village's reputation for peace and civility, but Agatha's focus remained steady. Her mind raced, assembling the fragments into a cohesive theory. Loose letters, torn pages, sightings of vehicles and strangers, and the echo of warnings from Eleanor March all pointed to a network of intentions converging upon Carsley at precisely this moment. The village, bathed in the gentle glow of dusk, felt both cozy and charged, a paradox that heightened Agatha's alertness without breaking the sense of place she cherished. Familiar scents, familiar streets, and the soft lamplight spilling from windows created a comforting backdrop against which the tension of pursuit and discovery sharpened. Agatha paused, pen poised over her notebook, capturing the intricate weave of details. Each observation, each whispered comment, each shadowed corner of Carsley was now part of a single, unfolding story. The quiet village held its secrets well, but Agatha felt a thrill at the thought of untangling them. She and Charles shared a brief, knowing glance. They were close, closer than ever, to seeing the threads converge and understanding the danger and intent behind James's.
Agatha's phone buzzed insistently just as she was reviewing for notes by the lamplight. The screen displayed Bill Wong's name, and the urgency in his tone was unmistakable before he even spoke. "Agatha, you need to come to the station right away. CCTV has caught James. He was seen near the abandoned railway hut on the outskirts of the village. We don't know what he's doing there." Her heart jumped, a mixture of relief and anxiety surging through her. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and phone, insisting on accompanying Bill. He hesitated briefly, knowing her tendency to charge headfirst into situations, but he understood her determination. Together, they set off toward the edge of Carsley, where the faint outline of the derelict railway line cut a straight path through brambles and low hedges. The railway hut emerged gradually from the shadows, its roof sagging, walls streaked with years of rain, and the windows opaque with grime. Despite its neglected appearance, there was a subtle sign of recent use, a thin trail of footprints leading up to the door, fresh in the soft earth. Agatha's pulse quickened as they approached. Every step crunched lightly over the gravel, the sound startling in the evening stillness. Inside, the hut smelled faintly of damp wood and old coal, but beneath it was a faint trace of tea and the lingering sweetness of biscuits. Agatha's eyes scanned immediately for clues. A blanket was draped carelessly over a bench, and a tea mug, half empty, sat on a makeshift table. Nearby, a discarded ration bar wrapper fluttered slightly as a breeze whispered through a cracked window. The signs were unmistakable. Someone had been here recently, but James himself was nowhere to be seen. Her gaze fell upon a small piece of paper pinned under a rock on the floor. Picking it up, Agatha noticed it was a map of Carsley. Certain locations were circled in pencil, but one area in particular, the village center, was circled 3 times in a careful, deliberate manner. Her mind raced. The triple circles suggested urgency, a pattern intended to draw attention, or perhaps mark strategic points. Someone was moving closer, closing in, and James was caught in the middle. Bill crouched beside her, scanning the room. All signs point to him being here recently, but he's either hiding or has been forced to move, he said cautiously. We need to consider both possibilities. Whoever or whatever brought him here might still be in play. Agatha nodded, her instincts already piecing together scenarios. The hut, though small and neglected, seemed to vibrate with the residue of intention. Every object, every footprint, every circle on the map contributed to a growing narrative. Agatha's mind replayed each detail from the previous days. The torn pages, the woman at her gate, the old photograph, and now this location, each a thread in the web surrounding James. The mystery was tightening around him, and she felt the mix of anticipation and dread that comes with understanding how close one is to a breakthrough. She carefully photographed the mug, blanket, and map with her phone, taking mental notes to cross-reference later. Every object could hold significance, even the smallest details, the position of the blanket, the tea's remnants, and the careful but deliberate pencil marks. It was all the language James, or someone tracking him, had left, waiting to be interpreted. Standing near the doorway, Agatha exhaled slowly, feeling both the gravity of the discovery and the promise of revelation. The hut, abandoned yet alive with recent presence, confirmed what she had long suspected. James's disappearance was no random act. Someone from the past, someone with intent, had drawn him into a deliberate pattern, and she was now standing at the edge of understanding. The next steps, she realized, could bring answers or danger.
Chapter 8. The Final Choice. The night air was crisp. As Agatha, Bill, and Charles approached the old signal tower, its silhouette dark against a sky brushed with fading twilight. The path leading to it was uneven, lined with brambles that scraped gently at their coats, but the tension in Agatha's chest kept her steps brisk and purposeful. Every instinct told her they were close, that the threads of the mystery she had been tracing for days were about to converge in this one location. The tower itself was a relic from another era, its iron framework rusted yet sturdy, the wooden stairs leading upward creaking faintly in the wind. Agatha's heart thudded, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She had prepared for confrontation, for danger, for answers that might shock or disappoint, but nothing could quite steady the flutter of hope and fear intertwined within her. They paused at the base, observing through the open door. Inside, James stood facing the man circled in the photograph. The figure's posture was tense, yet there was controlled restraint in his stance. Agatha recognized him immediately, the same face that had haunted the edges of her investigation for days, the one who had connected the photograph, the letter fragments, and the resurfaced warning into a tangible presence. The circled man's voice, when it came, was steady, but tinged with relief. "I didn't come for revenge," he said quietly. "I came for help. My life, it's complicated. Someone from the past, the same dispute James once faced, has resurfaced. I have nowhere else to turn." His words, measured yet sincere, shifted the atmosphere in the tower. Tension began to yield to understanding, suspicion to clarity. James exhaled slowly, the rigid posture softening. He admitted he feared exposure, his voice carrying the weight of years of responsibility and guilt. He didn't want anyone else, especially Agatha, to be caught in this. He thought he had to handle it alone, but the truth is, I needed guidance. You weren't the threat I imagined. Agatha stepped forward, her emotions raw yet measured. Relief and lingering concern mingled in her chest. The image of James, steadfast and self-reliant, yet quietly burdened, struck her anew. She watched as the two men exchanged a tense nod, a silent acknowledgment of shared history, of obligations once carried in isolation, now confronted openly. Bill and Charles lingered at the doorway, their presence steadying, offering both security and silent support. Agatha's gaze moved between James and the circled man, noting the subtle release in their shoulders, the easing of lines that had betrayed tension and worry for days. The room, though shadowed and small, felt lighter. Understanding had entered, and with it came the soft dissolution of fear. "You could have told me," Agatha said softly, her voice a mixture of admonition and empathy. James met her eyes, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. The corners of tension in his expression softened, replaced by the quiet warmth of trust renewed. The circled man nodded in agreement. "I misunderstood the situation," he admitted. "The secrecy, the caution, it was necessary, but perhaps I overestimated the threat you might pose, Agatha." With that, the emotional weight hanging in the air began to lift. The confrontation had fulfilled its purpose, not through conflict, but through revelation. The danger, though real, had been reframed as a misinterpretation of intentions and a lingering echo of a past dispute. Agatha's heart, still racing, found a steady rhythm again. She realized that James's final choice had never been about betrayal or distance, but the careful navigation of responsibility and protection. Now, with motives clear and fears addressed, a serene understanding settled over them all. The night outside, once tense with uncertainty, felt calm, almost gentle, and for the first time in days, Agatha could breathe freely, knowing the path forward was illuminated by truth and reconciliation. The night air felt softer now, almost forgiving, as Agatha followed James down the narrow, winding path from the signal tower. The tension of the day lingered only faintly, like a shadow that had been pushed aside, leaving a warm glow in its wake. Bill and Charles lingered briefly at the tower, giving them space, and Agatha found herself walking beside James in a quiet companionship that felt familiar, yet newly fragile, as though each step carried a cautious hope. Finally, James paused beneath the low-hanging boughs of a chestnut tree, the leaves rustling gently above them. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, the letter he had meant to send in its entirety. "I want you to hear the whole thing," he said softly, his voice carrying the gravity of intention rather than drama. Agatha nodded, her usual brashness tempered by curiosity and the weight of everything they had discovered. He unfolded the letter carefully, and the words began to flow aloud. It was not a proposal in the grand, sweeping sense she might have expected, nor a theatrical declaration. Instead, it was quietly earnest, an explanation of his choice to remain in Carsley, to honor the people and places that had shaped him, and to rebuild their connection with patience and thoughtfulness. He wrote of gratitude for her presence, for her tenacity, for the way she illuminated even the smallest corners of life he sometimes overlooked. Each sentence carried both intention and reflection, a careful honesty that struck Agatha deeply. She listened in near silence, absorbing the sincerity that permeated each line. Her usual bravado softened, replaced by a gentle warmth that filled the spaces around her. There was relief, yes, but also a subtle marvel at how James had transformed a letter into a quiet conduit for understanding, a bridge across the distance that had stretched between them in recent weeks. When he finished reading, the paper slipped from his hands, fluttering to the path at their feet. Agatha glanced at it, then back at him, noting the steadiness in his eyes, the careful consideration in his posture. For the first time that day, she felt entirely present with him, not as a detective, not as a worried friend, but as someone sharing the simple, delicate intimacy of knowing another person's heart. They resumed walking, the village around them quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bark of a dog. Their conversation was light, teasing in spots, acknowledging the humor that had always threaded through their friendship and the romance that had quietly grown in its shadow. Agatha noted how naturally their steps fell together, the rhythms of old familiarity blending seamlessly with the new understanding James had just shared. The street lamps flickered on as they passed the vicarage, casting soft pools of light on the cobbles. Agatha felt a calm certainty settle within her. The mystery, the tension, the unknowns that had shaped the last few days, those threads had been woven into clarity, leaving a warmth that was neither hurried nor forced. She trusted James's choice, not because it had been declared loudly, but because it had been made thoughtfully and shared openly. By the time they reached her gate, the village seemed to exhale alongside them, settling into the familiar comfort of night. Agatha paused, turning to James with a quiet smile. "You've made quite the dramatic build-up for something so simple," she said, a hint of playful reproach in her voice. James grinned, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Some things deserve quiet simplicity," he replied. They stepped inside together, the door closing gently behind them. Outside, Carsley remained peaceful, cozy, and just a little mysterious, a village ready to hold whatever the future might bring. Inside, Agatha felt the gentle satisfaction of resolution, tempered by the comforting knowledge that life, like a well-written story, leaves room for curiosity, laughter, and unexpected turns.